The candles in Wintershire Hall burned brighter than they had in years. Every window glowed gold against the autumn night, and carriages rolled up the long gravel drive one after another, carrying the finest families in the county. Tonight was the harvest ball, and everyone knew what it truly meant. After months of quiet waiting, Duke Alaric Wintershire was expected to announce his engagement to Lady Cordelia Ashworth. Inside the great house, the servants moved like a well-trained army. Silver trays gleamed, fresh flowers filled every hall. And near the grand entrance, arranging coats and wraps for the arriving guests, stood a young woman named Elira Hastings. Elira was 22 years old, with dark hair pulled back neatly beneath her cap, and hands that had grown rough from years of work. She was not born to this life of polished floors and crystal chandeliers. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father, a former groundskeeper, had passed only 2 years ago, leaving her to make her own way in the world. She had come to Wintershire Hall as a housemaid soon after, grateful for steady work and a roof over her head. She did not resent her position. She took pride in doing her work well, in being useful, in keeping her head down and her hands busy. But there were nights, like this one, when the laughter and music from the ballroom drifted through the halls, and she allowed herself a small, quiet wish that she could not name. Elira, called Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, hurrying past with an armful of table linens. Mind the cloakroom tonight, and smile, girl. It is a celebration, even if it is not ours. Elira smiled, the way she always did, and returned to her post. The guests began arriving in waves. Silk gowns swept across marble floors, jewels caught the candlelight. Elira took coats, hung shawls, and murmured polite greetings to people who barely looked at her. She was used to being unseen. In a house like this, servants were meant to be present but invisible, useful but unnoticed. She had long ago made peace with that truth. Then Lady Cordelia Ashworth arrived. She swept through the entrance in a gown of deep emerald silk, her chin lifted, her presence commanding the attention of the room the moment she stepped inside. She was beautiful in the practiced way of women raised to be admired, and she knew it. Behind her walked her cousin, Lord Reginald Vane, a thin man with a sharp tongue and a habit of laughing at things that were not funny. As Cordelia handed off her wrap, the hem of her gown caught briefly on the edge of a side table. Elira, reaching to steady the fabric and prevent a tear, accidentally pulled a thread loose instead. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but Cordelia noticed everything that concerned herself. "You clumsy creature," Cordelia said, her voice rising sharply enough to turn heads. "Do you have any idea what this gown cost? Look what you have done." "I am sorry, my lady," Elira said quietly, stepping back. "I was only trying to help." "Help," Cordelia repeated, as if the word amused her. She looked Elira up and down, taking in her plain gray dress, her reddened hands, the simple cap covering her hair. "You could not help me if you tried for 100 years. Look at you. Do you even know how to speak properly, or did they simply teach you to fetch and carry?" A few guests nearby chuckled. Lord Reginald stepped closer, grinning. "Careful, Cordelia," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "She might cry on your shoes next. Wouldn't want her tears ruining the silk as well as her clumsy hands did." More laughter followed. Elira felt her face grow hot, her throat tighten. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, but she knew better than to argue with a noblewoman in front of a crowd. She lowered her eyes instead, the way she had been taught, and said nothing. "Nothing to say?" Cordelia asked, tilting her head. "How disappointing. I suppose that is what happens when someone is raised without any manners at all. Run along now, before you break something else." Elira turned to go, her chest aching with a feeling she refused to let rise to her eyes. She had endured unkindness before. She told herself this was no different. She took one step toward the servants' corridor, ready to disappear from the ballroom entirely, when a voice cut through the noise of the crowd. "Elira!" The room did not fall silent all at once. It happened in pieces, like a wave rolling outward. First the guests nearest the doorway turned, then the ones near the staircase. Then, gradually, the entire ballroom quieted as heads turned toward the entrance, where Duke Alaric Wintershire stood. He had just arrived, dressed simply for a man of his rank, his dark coat unadorned, his expression unreadable. He had heard enough of the exchange to understand exactly what had happened, and something in his face had changed the moment he heard Alira's name spoken with such contempt. Alira turned, startled. She had not expected him to know her name at all. As far as she understood, the Duke had barely noticed her presence in the months since his return from abroad. She had assisted with his household like any other maid, careful never to draw attention, never expecting to be seen. But she was wrong about that. And what none of the guests in that ballroom knew, what not even Alira fully understood until this moment, was that the Duke remembered her very well. Months earlier, before Alaric had returned to society, before the black mourning clothes had been set aside, and the visits and dinners had resumed, he had spent his days in near solitude, grieving his father's sudden death. The old Duke had passed quickly, unexpectedly, leaving Alaric with a title he had not been ready to carry, and a house full of expectations he did not know how to meet. During those early weeks, unable to sleep, unable to sit through another condolence call, Alaric had taken to walking the grounds late in the evening, dressed plainly, avoiding the main paths where he might be recognized. He had wandered instead through the quieter servants' garden at the edge of the estate, a modest patch of herbs and vegetables tended by the household staff. It was there, one cold evening, that he had come upon a young woman sitting alone on a low stone wall, staring up at the sky. She had not recognized him. In his plain coat, and without any of the formal trappings of his position, she had simply seen a tired, grieving stranger, and she had spoken to him as one person speaks to another. They had talked for nearly an hour that night. She had told him, without knowing who he was, about losing her own father, about the strange quiet that follows a death, about how grief does not disappear, but simply changes shape over time, becoming something you learn to carry, rather than something that ever fully leaves. She had not offered empty comfort or rehearsed sympathy. She had simply been honest, and her honesty had done more for him than every formal condolence he had received. He had left that night without telling her who he was, and in the weeks that followed, he had searched quietly for her, only to learn from a groundskeeper that a young woman matching her description had been hired as a housemaid. He had not sought her out directly since, uncertain of how to approach the situation without disrupting her position or making her uncomfortable. But he had never forgotten her, and he had never forgotten what her kindness had meant to him during the hardest weeks of his life. Now, standing at the entrance of his own ballroom, watching her be mocked and humiliated by the very people he had once believed he might spend his life among, something inside him settled with quiet certainty. He crossed the ballroom floor. The crowd parted before him, without needing to be asked, guests stepping aside instinctively as he walked, his pace unhurried but purposeful. Cordelia straightened, clearly expecting him to come to her side, a small triumphant smile already forming on her lips. He walked past her without a glance. He stopped in front of Alira instead, and to the astonishment of everyone watching, he offered her a formal bow, the kind reserved for greeting an equal, not a servant. "Miss Hastings," he said, his voice steady and clear enough for the room to hear. "I did not expect to see you here tonight, though I am glad that I have." Alira stared at him, too stunned to respond immediately. "Your Grace," she managed finally, dropping into a hurried curtsy. "I am only attending the Coates tonight. I did not mean to cause any trouble." "You have caused no trouble," Alaric said. "None at all." He turned then, addressing the room, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom. "Some of you may not know this young woman. I did not know her properly myself, not until several months ago, during a time I do not often speak of. After my father passed, I found myself unable to bear the company of anyone who wished only to offer polite sympathy and move on. I wandered the grounds one evening, alone, and I met Miss Hastings quite by chance. I did not tell her who I was. She did not ask. She simply spoke to me honestly, about grief, about loss, about carrying on when carrying on feels impossible." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces, many of them frozen in stunned silence. "She gave me more comfort in one evening than I received in weeks of formal condolences from people far better acquainted with etiquette than with kindness," he continued. "I have thought of that conversation often since, and tonight, I arrived to find her mocked in my own home, in front of my own guests, for the crime of trying to help someone whose gown had caught on a table. Cordelia's face had gone pale. Lord Reginald shifted uncomfortably, no longer smiling. "I understand that many of you came tonight expecting an announcement," Alaric said. "I will not disappoint you entirely. I do intend to make one." He turned back to Alira, who stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. "I intend to court Miss Alira Hastings," he said, "properly, and with the intention of asking for her hand, should she be willing to consider it. I have come to understand, rather clearly tonight, that the next Duchess of Wintershire ought to be a woman of genuine character, not simply a woman of appropriate birth. I have found such a woman. I do not intend to lose her twice." A murmur swept through the ballroom, disbelief mixing with quiet astonishment, and here and there, genuine smiles among those who valued kindness over rank. Cordelia turned and walked swiftly from the ballroom, Lord Reginald trailing after her, neither of them speaking, both of them aware that whatever standing they had hoped to gain that evening was now entirely lost. Elira looked up at Alaric, her eyes wide, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "Your Grace, I do not know what to say. I never expected any of this. I am only a maid." "You were the only honest person I spoke to in the worst weeks of my life," Alaric said gently. "Titles can be given, kindness cannot. I would rather spend my life beside someone who offers the second, freely and without calculation, than someone who merely inherited the first." From the doorway leading to the servants' quarters, Mrs. Pemberton stood watching, one hand pressed to her chest, tears gathering in her eyes, though she was smiling brightly enough to light the room herself. Alaric extended his hand toward Elira. "Would you do me the honor of the first dance, Miss Hastings? Not as a servant of this house, but as my guest." Elira looked at his hand, then at the sea of faces watching her, waiting. For a moment, the old fear returned, the instinct to lower her eyes and step back into the shadows where she had always felt safest. But then she thought of the honest conversation she had shared with a grieving stranger months ago, of how right it had felt to simply speak from the heart without pretense. She placed her hand in his. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said. The orchestra, sensing the moment, began to play. And as Duke Alaric Wintershire led Elira Hastings onto the floor of his own ballroom, the guests who had laughed at her only minutes before now watched in respectful silence, understanding that they had witnessed something far more meaningful than the engagement they had originally come to see. They had witnessed the quiet, unshakable truth that true worth is never measured by title or birth, but by the honesty and kindness a person carries within them, and that sometimes the person overlooked by everyone in the room is the very one worth seeing most of all.